Ich habe nur auf das Nicken vom Markus gewartet, weil wir das immer so machen, dass einer von uns beiden dann noch einen Blick vor die Tür wirft, ob da noch jemand draußen steht. Damit habe ich den Markus schon vorgestellt, stelle ich mich noch kurz vor. Mein Name ist Leo Küberger, Markus Gönnitzer. Wir beide machen seit mittlerweile 5 Jahren diese Reihe, die da heißt Debating Society. Also einige im Publikum oder viele könnten sie kennen. Es ist die Ausgabe Nummer 37 oder 38, das ist nicht so klar. Aber ja, wir sind weit jenseits der 30 und gehen auf die 50 zu. Debating Society findet immer am ersten Mittwoch des Monats statt, im Frühjahr sowie im Herbst. Und uns ging es darum und geht es nach wie vor darum, Bücher vorzustellen, Neuerscheinungen in der Regel, spannende Neuerscheinungen, wenn möglich. Und das machen wir jetzt eben seit 5 Jahren und wahrscheinlich auch noch eine Zeit länger. Ich darf euch alle, at the beginning I will say some words in German and then we'll switch to English because yeah, maybe there are some people who don't understand German, but we will switch to English in a couple of minutes. Ich darf euch insgesamt begrüßen hier im Forum Stadtpark. Für alle, die noch nicht so oft hier waren, es gibt einen Getränkeautomaten, nicht Automaten, einen Kühlschrank, ganz wichtig. Also jetzt ist auch noch so der gute Zeitpunkt, sich dort zu bedienen. Es gibt dann, darauf werde ich sicher noch das eine oder andere Mal hinweisen, einen Büchertisch. Also man kann die Bücher, die hier vorgestellt werden, dann auch immer käuflich erwerben. Heute, und da freue ich mich sehr, weil mich das Buch eine Zeit lang im letzten Jahr beschäftigt hat, stellen wir das Buch, das kürzlich auf Deutsch erschienen ist, vor. Und zwar hat es den schönen Titel Gentrifizierung, lässt sich nicht aufhalten und andere Lügen. Also das Original ist im letzten Jahr auf Englisch erschienen und jetzt vor ein paar Wochen beim Unrast Verlag in Münster auf Deutsch. Und die Autorin Leslie Kern, die schon hier neben mir Platz genommen hat, befindet sich im Moment auf einer sehr beeindruckenden Tour. Now I'm talking about that I'm so impressed by the tour you are doing. Ich wusste nur davon, dass sie 13 Buchvorstellungen in 13 Tagen macht, in Deutschland, Österreich, Slowakei, Tschechien, Schweiz und dann geht es noch weiter nach Italien, habe ich heute erfahren. Also insgesamt sind es ungefähr 20 Termine, die sie da in diesen Tagen macht und da freuen wir uns, also insgesamt sind es ungefähr 20 Termine, die sie da in diesen Tagen macht und da freuen wir uns sehr, dass sie nach Städten wie Frankfurt und Vorstädten wie Wien und Zürich auch einen Abstecher nach Graz macht. Wie gesagt, dieses Buch werden wir heute vorstellen. Noch 2 Sätze zu Leslie Kern. Sie lehrt Geografie an der Mount Allison University in Kanada, hat in den letzten Jahren, oder viele kennen wahrscheinlich Publikationen von ihr, einiges wurde auch ins Deutsche übertragen. Feminist City ist ebenfalls bei Unrast erschienen, ist, glaube ich, jetzt in der 2. oder 3. Auflage. Also war auch erfreulicherweise sehr erfolgreich. Leslie Kern bloggt auch und twittert, also manche kennen sie vielleicht auch darüber. Und heute werden wir aber über ihr neues Buch zum Thema der Gentrifizierung sprechen. Für einige im Publikum oder viele im Publikum, die sich mit stadtpolitischen Themen beschäftigen, ist dieser Begriff auch nichts Neues, für manche dann vielleicht doch. Aber für die es etwas Neues ist, wird sich das hoffentlich im Fortgang des Abends heute alles klären. Und wir haben nicht nur die Vorstellung des Buches natürlich, sondern auch die Möglichkeit, mit Leslie dann über Gentrifizierung, über ihr Buch zu diskutieren. Also wir freuen uns sehr auf die Fragen und Kommentare, die es im Anschluss an die Präsentation gibt. Sie wird ungefähr so, also sie wird eine Passage vorlesen zum einen und dann noch so 20, 30 Minuten das Buch vorstellen, weil alle haben es vielleicht dann doch noch nicht gelesen, damit wir alle so ein wenig auf demselben Stand sind. Wichtige Vorbemerkung noch, und die muss jetzt auf Deutsch sein. Also insgesamt wird der Abend in englischer Sprache sein. Es gibt aber die Möglichkeit, und jetzt komme ich noch einmal zum Markus, der da in der Ecke sitzt, zurück. Also wer eine Flüsterübersetzung haben möchte, kann diese gerne bekommen und müsste sich dann aber da in diese Ecke hin bewegen. Also das könnt ihr gerne machen. Also Markus hat angeboten zu übersetzen, aber oft ist es eben auch so, dass man zwar vielleicht dem Vortrag gut folgen kann, aber vielleicht dann doch bei den Fragen oder Kommentaren das lieber auf Deutsch machen möchte, ist überhaupt kein Problem. In welcher Sprache auch immer ihr dann fragen und kommentieren und beitragen wollt, ist es möglich. In welcher Sprache auch immer, ist jetzt vielleicht ein bisschen zu hoch gegriffen. Ja, ihr könnt es auch gerne, ist überhaupt kein Stress, also während des Vortrags, wenn ihr das Gefühl habt, es ist euch doch lieber mit Übersetzung, dann zum Markus gehen. Aber wie gesagt, vor allem im Teil, wenn es um Fragen und Kommentare geht, gerne auch auf Deutsch. Gut, das war es einmal mit der Einleitung von meiner Seite, und now it's time to switch to English. You told me that you had some German lessons in school, but couple of years ago, so I'm not sure. And also the German we are talking here in the southern part of Austria is maybe a bit different from the German you had in school. Everybody's laughing. It's really true. Yeah, it's really great to have you here. You had some problems in the morning from Frankfurt to Graz, and so we are really happy to have you here. And I want, it's time to know more about gentrification and about the way you are understanding gentrification and this process that is going on, and so many people are struggling against it, and especially, and I think that's core in your whole book and in your argument, this kind of intersectional analysis you're doing. And so, yeah, I want to ask you to begin.
Well, thank you very much, Leo and Marcus, and to everyone who has worked to bring me here today. And I'm very honored to be a part of this longstanding event that you've had. I know we did a virtual event a few years ago. It seems like a million years ago, but it's really exciting to be here in person. And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. I thought I would start out tonight by reading a little bit from one of the first chapters of the book, and then give you a general overview of the main themes and arguments and what I hope readers to take away from the project. And then I'm very happy to open it up to conversation, comments, questions, stories, whatever anyone wants to share. So, as the title of the book suggests, the other lies part, that each chapter of the book tries to take a different kind of story about gentrification, a different way of understanding gentrification, and break it down, add some nuance, um, add some intersectional analysis. And I'll tell you more about that when I get to the overview. But the first chapter of the book is really the one that I think is a lie, rather than just a story that needs more nuance. And so I'm going to read from that section, and it is from the chapter called Gentrification is Natural. I love following Instagram accounts dedicated to historical photos of my hometown, Toronto, and I especially enjoy before and after images contrasting the old and the new. It's fascinating to see how much has changed, and even more interesting, what is simply layered over remnants of the past. In being drawn into these images, one could be forgiven for interpreting the changes as part of a natural growth process, one that seems organic and perhaps even predetermined by some kind of urban DNA. The city spreads out, it grows upward, it becomes increasingly dense, it moves more quickly. Like the growth of any organism, it seems to be fulfilling its natural destiny. Indeed, the idea of the city is an attractive one, allowing us to superimpose its beating heart, nerve centers, arteries, and veins over our own. Unfortunately, the transfer of concepts from the natural world to built environments can mask the all too human foundations of the places we call home. Evoking natural processes feels like a useful way to make sense of a complicated thing like a city, but it's also an effective way to make power relations invisible. The first story about gentrification in this book, then, is one that has done a lot of damage and requires pushback. Here, I counter the idea that gentrification is a natural, expected, inevitable, normal process by asking who wins and who loses when we say, but isn't it just natural? It's not hard to understand why it's so tempting to grasp at evolution, the laws of physics, and anthropomorphism, attributing human characteristics, to help us get a handle on how cities change. Humans are fond of metaphor. For one thing, metaphors let us make connections between different sorts of objects and ideas and allow us to see them in new ways. As a writer, I can't argue against metaphor. But a metaphor is not the same thing as an explanation. And this is where things start to get slippery when we talk about, for example, cities as evolving organisms. Evolution is a powerful theory that helps us explain, to make sense of, the dizzyingly complex and dynamic living world. There's comfort in an explanation. It gives a measure of stability, predictability, and certainty. The laws of evolution bring a perception of order to a constantly changing environment. It's no wonder we're so eager to apply these laws to other elaborate systems, including our cities. In an informal way, we often use the word evolve as a synonym for change. However, evolve, in its casual use, in English at least, also connotes some kind of positive or desirable change, such as an increase in complexity, efficiency, or even developing knowledge and wisdom. In other words, it's not a neutral signifier. The theory of evolution has also been applied to cities and to gentrification processes in particular, in ways that go well beyond synonym and metaphor. And proponents of this way of thinking are not necessarily subtle about it. Gentrification is a natural evolution was a 2014 headline in The Guardian for a piece in which opinion writer Philip Ball drew on the work of scholar Sergio Porta to argue that, quote, troubled London neighborhoods like Brixton and Battersea were undergoing an evolutionary process, taking them from crime and drug-ridden to bohemian and trendy. Ball describes natural organisms and the gentrification of, quote, edgy London areas as almost a law of nature. Porta and his colleagues, writing in the intriguingly named journal Physics and Society, claim to have found a formula that predicts gentrification. They argue that cities obey certain natural laws and that these take primacy over the intentional interventions of planners, politicians, and developers. I'll quote again, looked at this way, the researchers are studying city evolution much as biologists study natural evolution, almost as if the city itself were a natural organism, end quote. Based on these assumptions, Porta concludes that gentrification is actually healthy for cities, suggesting that, quote, it's a reflection of their ability to adapt, a facet of their resilience. Now, longtime Brixton and Battersea residents might view their resiliency in a different way, as a facet of their ability to survive against a wave of changes that have threatened these Black, multicultural, and working class boroughs in different ways across decades. Indeed, the language of evolution and healthy adaptation is particularly galling given the racialized context where people of color are being displaced by and for white gentrifiers. Residents and local businesses fear rising rents and displacement as multimillionaire foreign investors buy up spaces like the Brixton Market and blanket Battersea in luxury high-rise developments. A Brixton Market store owner told the New York Times, "All the local people, ethnic minorities, are being driven away. I'll try to stay as long as I can." In the much lauded Vauxhall Nine Elms Battersea Opportunity area, luxury flats owned by speculative buyers sit empty, while those in the affordable buildings and shared ownership units enter their flats through segregated pour doors and face the noise and dust of the construction site for London's new super sewer. So the gentrification is natural adaptation story assumes that the actual people in these neighborhoods matter less, or perhaps not at all, than the physical environment. It's as if the changes happening are driven by laws of location, street configuration, and building type, rather than decisions made by real people, and that these changes are experienced in an abstract, spatial way, rather than by human beings whose daily lives and physical and mental well-being are threatened. Despite the protestations of those fighting displacement, there is a lure to the natural evolution story, a way in which it appeals to a deep-seated cultural need to reduce what we observe to a set of cause and effect relationships guided by immutable laws that we have no control over. It makes things so much simpler. After all, what's the point in trying to challenge the physics of the city? We might as well defy gravity. What's interesting to me is the work this story does. I find it helpful to keep the effects, intended or otherwise, of these natural law claims at the front of mind. First, these claims absolve us of responsibility. If something like gentrification is just a law of physics, then it's no one's fault, and no one should feel responsible for trying to do anything about it. Second, the word natural tends to imply good and right. So not only are these changes inevitable, they're beneficial in the long term. In Western worldviews, change itself is seen as progress, and progress is good, always moving us towards a better future. Third, these claims release us back into the comforting arms of the status quo. We can be reassured that the way things are happening is just the way they should be happening. Okay, I'll pause my reading there. So maybe I'll start my overview of the book just by telling you why I wrote this book. Obviously, there are a lot of books out there about gentrification, but I found in surveying the literature that there weren't a lot, at least in English, of accessible books that address the current state of gentrification. And by accessible, I mean books that are designed to be read by a wide audience of people, not just other gentrification researchers or urban scholars or planners, but books that could be picked up by anyone who lives in a city, cares about cities, is looking around their neighborhood and wondering what's happening here. Why is the rent so damn high? Maybe wondering things like, am I a gentrifier? Am I part of the problem? So I wrote the book to present in what I hope is a fairly clear way a lot of interesting research about gentrification, but in such a way that folks who just want to understand it a little bit more than the kind of surface level explanations that we see in the media or these sort of taken for granted common sense stories that we're told, they can pick up this book and dig a little deeper. As Leo mentioned, I also try to use an intersectional approach, which to me means looking at the ways that different forms of power are playing out in a process like gentrification. So of course we have class power, but there are other forms as well, and I can say a little bit more about that in a moment. I also noticed that most of the somewhat popular books about gentrification are not at all hopeful in their perspective, and I don't blame them for being that way. Gentrification can seem like a terrible, overwhelming process that leads to a lot of suffering and despair. We have books with titles like How to Kill a City, Hollow City, Vanishing New York. These are some of the more, I don't know, popular and accessible books about gentrification, but they will not really leave you with a good sense of what you might begin to do about it. So I certainly wanted to discuss in great detail the problems of gentrification, but also to offer some ways forward by sharing examples of successful resistance from cities all over the world, and also ways that you, the reader, if you're left at the end of the book at least marginally convinced by the argument that gentrification is not inevitable, that you could find some ways that you could start to contribute to positive change in your own community. The book does offer some history of gentrification, but I wanted to also chronicle some, certainly not all, of the range of modern manifestations of gentrification in the 21st century. So we have all different kinds of actors and forms that gentrification is taking, and I'm sure new ones are being invented in somebody's mind as we sit here speaking right now. So when gentrification was first named in the 1960s, people were observing what seemed at the time to be a kind of a slow process. The sociologist Ruth Glass, who coined the term, said that the kind of aspirational middle classes in North London were tiptoeing into working class neighborhoods and gradually over time transforming the neighborhood. But I think for many people in cities today, looking around their communities, it doesn't feel like anything is tiptoeing around them. It feels more like a steamroller, or like almost an overnight process. It may not literally be overnight, but gentrification feels a lot faster and a lot more powerful, and is not necessarily being initiated by individual middle class households anymore, although they're still part of the process. Today, we see in many cases the state taking a very active role in facilitating gentrification, both by putting in place policies or stripping away policies that would prevent gentrification to kind of smooth the path forward. And also the state being an active partner in redevelopment projects for housing, commercial districts, tourist districts, even green gentrification, and being an active partner with the private sector in pushing those projects forward and funding them. And of course, we have the corporate sector in many different manifestations, both from absolutely massive transnational billion-dollar corporations, pension funds, huge financial actors that are involved in the commodification of housing. We also have the promotion of the kind of like small investor gentrification. I've been noticing, and maybe some of you see these on your social media. ads for, how you can get started today investing in real estate and to become a landlord, or to make your first million on Airbnb by renting out your apartment. We have uh, real estate influencers now on TikTok and YouTube to tell ordinary people how to become active in this commodification of housing. So, and I mean, speaking of Airbnb, I also talk about that in the book as a kind of modern um, pathway for gentrification, but which takes um, potential rental housing out of the long-term rental market and contributes to rent inflation. So we could go on and on and on about these different processes, and the book tries to cover a range of them to give some sense of the many kind of tentacles, if you will, of gentrification today, and how it has changed and adapted over many decades. Of course, the main argument of the book is certainly, I hope, implied in the title, that gentrification is not, in fact, inevitable. I hope that that is the ultimate takeaway message from the book, because to me, if we cede to the story that gentrification is inevitable or that it's somehow natural, then there's really no point to any of this research, writing, or even just ranting about it to our friends. The point has to be to help us imagine alternatives, whether they're new alternatives or, you know, resurrecting old alternatives. The point has to be thinking about different housing futures for our cities, not just diagnosing the problem, but being able to point towards solutions, imperfect as they may be. But to me, that's the whole point. And so, in order to push that argument forward throughout the book, I try to challenge certain myths about gentrification and to tell the story of gentrification in a number of different ways. So, as you heard in the first chapter, I push back on the idea that gentrification is natural. And as I said, that to me is in fact a lie that we have to, 100% push back on. The other stories in the book, I wouldn't go so far as to call them lies, but it makes a good title for the book. The other stories are ones that I think need fresh perspectives, put it that way. So, for example, I have a chapter called "Gentrification is About Class," and of course, class is and has always been central to gentrification, but it's not the only form of power that propels gentrification forward. And it's also not the only, shall we say, axis of difference along which people feel the impacts of gentrification. So I talk about gender and gentrification, so using a feminist perspective, an anti colonial perspective on gentrification. I talk a fair bit about race and gentrification and how racial difference and racial hierarchies are a key part in many cities of how gentrification has proceeded, and of course, how it has impacted different groups. And I also talk about things like age, ability, and sexuality, as well as, yeah, axes of power and difference that processes like gentrification kind of take advantage of to move itself forward. So ultimately, my claim about gentrification is that it is about power, the power to take and remake space, either in your own image, for your own benefit, or for your own profit, essentially, your own ability to extract some form of wealth and capital from that space. Gentrification involves the power to decide what is the norm in any given space. So by norms, I mean kind of the cultural side of cities. So what sorts of behavior are acceptable or wanted in a city? What are the sounds, the sights, the smells, the products, and the services that are seen to be desirable? And of course, what are those that get marked as disorderly, unpleasant, antisocial, and undesirable? Gentrification is about the power to extract profit and also labor from place and people. I think the labor piece is an important one that is not looked at that often, and I take inspiration here from the work of Ipsita Chatterjee, who writes about the way that there's so much unpaid, collective, and often feminized or work done by women to maintain community when places have been kind of abandoned by the state and by capital. And when gentrification comes, it essentially takes advantage of all of that unpaid, collective, feminized labor in order to turn that space into a commodity that brings value to outsiders, not to those who've spent their lives and often an intergenerational period of time sustaining the community in the face of great struggle. Um, Coming from the Canadian context as a settler colonial society where the colonizers never left, gentrification can also be thought of as the power to consolidate settler colonial control and ownership, because it is essentially about deepening private property ownership in the city, which contributes to the ongoing dispossession and dislocation of Indigenous people. And gentrification is about the power to further entrench and deepen existing inequalities and power relations across race, gender, sexuality, age, and ability. Throughout the book, I also try to keep a kind of human face on the effects of gentrification. It's certainly, when we read a lot of theory about gentrification, it can seem kind of abstract when we're talking about, I don't know, the principles that dictate the flow of capital into one space and out of another, and so on. And sometimes the human side of what that means can get a little bit lost. So in the chapter on displacement, I try to include research that draws on the voices of people who have been impacted by gentrification, both people who have been physically displaced, pushed out of their homes and communities, but also people who have stayed in place yet felt like their neighborhood is no longer their home. That because of all the changes happening around them, they don't feel welcome in their own community anymore. They feel as though they're looked at as an outsider, as a less desirable resident, even though they may have been there for their whole lives or longer. So that kind of emotional displacement, a sense of being unhomed, is also something that I think is important to consider when we think about gentrification. Not everybody is forced to leave their neighborhood, but they can still feel serious emotional, physical, psychological effects as the neighborhood changes around them. So in order to move the ending of the book towards a more hopeful note, I, in the second to last chapter, offer a range of examples from cities around the world where communities have pushed back on gentrification, have fought against particular kinds of development, have won battles against housing speculation in their communities. Also examples where city governments have actually tried to use some of the regulatory tools available to them to put up barriers against displacement and ongoing commodification of housing. And these take all sorts of forms, from artistic expression to draw awareness to gentrification, to direct action protests, squatting, the kind of visible mobilization, to partnering with local government to form nonprofit housing coalitions, community land trusts, and more. And I hope that by offering that little kind of sampling of examples of resistance, it can work against the all too common story that we're told that resistance is kind of futile, or that it's doomed to fail, or that it's not really going to change anything. Because even though none of the examples that I give could be said to have erased gentrification or completely reversed it, they have sometimes won meaningful changes for lives of people in those communities. And I also think that often we don't hear those stories of success. They simply don't get kind of told in the media, and indeed even in gentrification research. Research on resistance has been strangely lacking over the many decades. So even though this is not a comprehensive overview of all resistance against gentrification, I hope that people are like, oh yeah, there are examples out there, and we could learn from these. We could learn from what people in other cities are trying, and actually, build up a portfolio of different potential. And that was originally going to be the last chapter of the book, but I sort of thought for the reader, okay, it's one thing to sort of see these examples from potentially far off places and think, oh yeah, those are interesting. But maybe you are that person that I described at the beginning, who's kind of looking around your community and thinking, yeah, things are really changing around here. Like, how are we going to get together and make a difference? Or maybe you're uh, on the other side of things, or maybe not the other side, but you're sort of wondering, like, oh, I've moved into a new neighborhood. Am I perceived as a gentrifier? How can I be a good neighbor and not contribute to the problem? So I wanted to end the book with a series of feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial principles for thinking through how we kind of act in solidarity around different causes, and some ideas for people to think about how you can start today to act in ways that you feel are ethical, responsible, neighborly, everything from learning about whose land you're on to the history of displacement, segregation, renewal, and gentrification in your community, to figuring out what community organizations there are already doing about the problem, to see how other work that you're involved in, whether maybe it's around food security, maybe it's around violence against women, seeing how these issues intersect with gentrification to help create that solidarity. I will say that I don't believe that it is, an individual's responsibility to solve gentrification, or that by making different choices as individuals, like deciding that we're, going to spend our money at this, local coffee shop instead of a corporate chain, that's going to solve gentrification. I don't think that is ultimately where the true responsibility lies. I think we do have to think about how we can collectively push our so-called leaders to actually lead and to make a difference. But at the same time, I think many people also they want to think about ways to make a set of choices that feel like they're not necessarily part of the problem, even if they are not the entire solution. So I try to strike a little bit of a balance there. So I hope that gives you a decent overview, and I'm happy to say more about any of those topics, I think maybe Leo has a few questions for me, and we can open things up to the audience as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Before we move on to the audience, I have maybe one very concrete question. Could you say a few words about the term settler colonialism? Because I think it's maybe not that common here in Europe, and for your book, and also I think for all everything that is going on in Northern America, it's very important. So maybe you could say a few words about that, and then I would like to hear. I know the stories because I read the book, but maybe you could share some of the examples of successful stories of resistance against gentrification. I think that's something everybody is interested in. So maybe you could share some of these examples, maybe your favorite ones, I don't know, or the ones where you had the feeling, oh, they read my book before they started their struggle, who knows? Yeah, that's just now.
Sure. So the term settler colonialism or a settler colonial society is used to describe places that might include like Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, places that were colonized by Europeans, mostly the British and the French, with a few others playing roles there as well. And the colonizers essentially never left. There was never a sort of decolonial movement or moment where the existing colonial state kind of packed up and went back home and left things to return to the control of the indigenous people. So the use of the term settler colonial society is helpful for reminding us that even though it seems like, oh, colonialism happened a long time ago, it's still happening, right, in these places. It continues today in with somewhat new manifestations, but it's still part of an ongoing chain of colonial conquering and control and ongoing removal of sovereignty from indigenous people. And one of the ways in which this connects to gentrification is that sometimes you could go to like an anti-gentrification protest, and you might see a sign that activists had written that said something like, gentrification is the new colonialism, right? Like that in a metaphorical sense, that gentrification is like colonization because it's a group of powerful outsiders coming and taking over place and extracting wealth and resources from local people. But for many indigenous people, they say gentrification isn't a new colonialism, it's an old colonialism. It's a continuation of this process of powerful outsiders coming, taking over land, commodifying it, extracting profit from it, and so on. So for me, especially writing from the Canadian context as a descendant of settlers, on that land, it's important to acknowledge that sometimes anti-gentrification activism has not paid very much attention to the issues of Indigenous people and has sometimes, co-opted sometimes problematic language around like occupying spaces or taking back land without really recognizing that there were others here before. So I wanted to think about how a set of kind of anti-colonial principles could also infuse gentrification activism and research. So I hope that helps to answer that question. So as for some maybe stories, examples from the book of resistance, one of my favorites that I think maybe I start the chapter with. I can't remember. I haven't reread my book in a little while. It's it's a story that begins with a direct action protest and ends with a community land trust, and it comes from Oakland, California, a place that has seen rapid uh, increases in housing prices as a kind of spillover from San Francisco with the kind of huge, I don't know, tech propelled housing crisis there. Oakland is a very diverse city, a largely Black population, many people struggling for housing. So a group of women who called themselves Oakland Moms for Housing occupied an empty house, a big house, very, a large house that was sitting vacant. Nobody was living in it. So this was largely a group of Black women, sometimes with their children, single mothers, who were basically making the point that it is criminal to have housing sitting empty when there are people with no housing at all in your city. So they squatted at this home for a number of weeks, maybe a couple of months before the corporation that owned this home and many others like it in the Oakland area moved to have the women forcibly evicted by the sheriff. At that moment, the kind of media exposure of this event grew because we had this potential confrontation between the police and the women. Some local city councilors became aware of the issue and actually went down to support the women and to say, like, actually, yes, this is a problem that we have these homes sitting empty for no other reason than the company wants to let them kind of appreciate in value before selling them for a profit. So fast forward through this, some of the negotiations and so on that went on um, at this moment. And what happened was that the company that was involved in buying and kind of sitting on these empty properties, it's called Wedgwood, agreed with the city and with the activists to give those properties over into a community land trust, which is where like a nonprofit organization controls either small pieces of property or a large area or a number of properties and decides what can be done with them. It kind of takes them off of the open market and um, allows for a kind of collective decision making about how they're going to be used. So this to me was an interesting example of something that started with, something that has a long history, right? Squatting in abandoned housing to make a point about housing, but that actually ended with this corporation sort of agreeing to give over all of these properties into a community land trust. This is only from a few years ago, so I think we probably have to wait a little while to see how successful this is down the road and who kind of benefits from this process. It's maybe too early to say, clear uh you know clear victory here, but to me it's shows that again resistance isn't futile and that there are other kinds of outcomes that can come from these sorts of things. um I don't know, do you have a favorite example that you want me to talk about, or that I'm trying to
Actually,
remember all of them now.
the Oakland moms for housing are one of my favorite examples, and it's the beginning of the chapter,
Yes,
far
yes.
as I remember.
Why did the company did that? Like, why did they do that? I mean, how did they?
Yeah, from my understanding of it, just from reading like media reports about it, it was this sort of combination of this like media exposure, which, named the company and made them look pretty villainous in both like in the local and national media. I suspect there was probably also some kind of, backroom stuff going on with the I don't mean backroom in a bad way, but just maybe outside of the view of the media of the city politicians who were like, listen, you know, you're looking pretty bad here, and we need to do something about this. Like, what are some ways that we can, move forward towards a solution that, doesn't make you look like like a Disney villain here. And I mean, let's be honest, I suspect that at the end of the day, these properties that went to the community land trust, it's kind of a drop in the bucket of the profits overall of a company like this. So it probably doesn't do them a huge amount of financial harm and makes them look good in the short term. That would be my guess as to why they agreed to this. Yeah.
Robin already started with the question. So there's time that you can ask Leslie for more examples if you want to. There are a lot of these examples in the book, and that's also one of my favorite ones. And because of that, I think what I really liked about that example is also they were squatting these houses, and also here in especially in Germany and Netherlands and Austria and Italy and a lot of other places, we have a long history in squatting. But it really starts with the name of the group. It's Oakland Moms for Housing. It really changes the whole. It's not like, I really love 20-year-olds who squat a house. But here's a real difference also. And I had the feeling that they did it in a very clever way, because to say it's Oakland Moms for Housing, they're moms without housing, and so it's time to act. And I think from that on, there was a lot of pressure on the city council and so on. I would have more questions, but I don't want to stop you from asking. And here's the first one. There's also a microphone that makes it easier for the others to understand in the room.
I can talk louder now. Cool. How much does your book focus on the phenomenon of gentrification in the sort of English speaking or Anglo-Saxon world? Is it something that varies across sort of the regions where it is found? Do you discuss this in the book?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I do, although simply because of my, where I study and the language that I speak, there's going to inevitably be a kind of geographic and political bias towards some places more than others. But I did try to look for examples from every continent. I think I say except Antarctica, because I don't think we have gentrification there yet. But tell me if I'm wrong there. But yes, I mean, and I think one of the things that's interesting is that even in very different political contexts, right? Some that are, we have ones that are extremely capitalist and free market oriented, and other places where there is still more state control of the economy, and yet gentrification is happening in these places as well. And just the degree to which we have either like sort of corporate control of the process, maybe versus more state-led versions of the process, that definitely has like a geographic variation to it. Yeah.
More questions? Not at the moment. Yeah.
I would actually love to. Oh, I think I don't need the mic.
Okay. Yeah, I would actually just love to hear one more example, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. You want to give another example, or are there some more questions at the moment? Because we can spend the whole night with fantastic examples. But yes, so maybe another example. Yep.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about what I want to talk about. Maybe another example. This one is from Chicago in the U.S., where in a couple of neighborhoods in particular, the Pilsen neighborhood and a neighborhood called Little Village, since the mid 20th century, they have had a lot of am I trying to say? Migrants from Mexico and other Spanish-speaking parts of the world, predominantly Mexican immigrants, though, and these folks had been kind of in the mid 20th century displaced from other areas of Chicago west into Pilsen, and then further west into Little Village, and in the later part of the 20th century, gentrification started to creep into Pilsen, and now it's creeping into Little Village as well. But one of the things that's interesting in these places is that there is this kind of intergenerational history of resistance to displacement. So there's the resistance to displacement from the like mid 20th century urban renewal projects, which some people would say are a kind of gentrification, but they were like totally state-led projects. And the people in those communities really draw on that like intergenerational wealth of knowledge and as a kind of a political rallying cry, like we won't be displaced again, right? Like you've taken our communities from us before and you're not going to do it again. So they kind of are drawing on that strength, on that history, on the like knowledge of activism that has gone before in order to try to create ways to stay in place. And so it's not that they have completely stopped gentrification, but what's happened there is that in both of those neighborhoods, activist organizations make it very difficult for new development to happen. So when developers come and they say, oh, we'd love to build a new condominium building here, it's not like the community, you know, kind of, oh, there's a community meeting and nobody goes. Like everybody goes and everybody argues the hell out of it with the developers, and they push their city councilors, the aldermen in Chicago, and they're like, we don't want, like they make life very difficult around any project that they don't want to happen. And I think that's in part because of that like long history of that resistance that those activists are able to draw on as a kind of source of strength and as a rallying cry for the community.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm having a question as well, both about the role of informal actors that you have already covered with these brilliant examples. And my question is about how the court takes place in this anti-gentrification, and is it really useful to struggle with legal power via the court? So probably do have such examples when as the communities where this side who put the case into the court or the city council was, and who has won. Thank you.
Yeah, that reminds me of another example from the book from the UK, where in they have social housing projects that are old, they're crumbling, they're kind of falling apart. They need so-called modernization and renovation. They call it urban regeneration there. And in order to do that, people who live in those places are displaced, right? They're forced to go live somewhere else while their estates are regenerated. And this regeneration usually doesn't mean, oh, we're just going to build really nice new social housing for everybody. It's like, we'll build a little bit of social housing with a poor door over there, and we'll attach some luxury high-rise flats to it as well, right? And in the meantime, I mean, so not everybody's going to get to go back in the first place, but in the meantime, people can be sent to all sorts of different places, not necessarily in the same part of London, for example, or even outside of the city. And so a particular group, I forget the name, I think it was an Aylesbury estate, they went to court with the local borough who was trying to move them around to argue that they had a right to essentially to dwell in their community. So a right not to be, pushed out to some far-flung part of the city where their kids have to change school, where they can't get to their job, where there's, their grandparents don't live, where they don't have a social network or community support. And they were actually successful in the court. The court agreed that they had a right to essentially dwell in place. So it's just like one little example, but I think it was an interesting case where there was sort of, taking it through the legal system to say, displacement is not, it's not just about like, well, if you've given this family another 4 walls somewhere, then it's fine. They have nothing to complain about. But that actually displacement is about like so much more than just whether you have another place to live or not. And that was, kind of recognized in that decision.
Yes, thank you. While reading your book and also now following your arguments that you made, the point that you make is about narratives for me the most, like that gentrification is natural. And we talked about that earlier, that gentrification, at least in the context of Europe, is often used as the only possible way to get some kind of improvement from like government side. Like governments only improve districts with public transport, medical care, and all of those things if they are somewhat desirable neighborhoods in a gentrifying sense. So governments use this narrative as well to attract capital to invest in it as well. So maybe you can phrase some different kind of narrative that would also allow for more public transport being put in place in neighborhoods, or more medical care, more childcare, all of these things, without it being gentrification naturally.
Yes, you point to a really key issue, and it's a question that people will often ask me, sometimes genuinely, sometimes trying to be a bit of a devil's advocate, like, don't poor communities deserve nice things? Like, shouldn't they get a good public transit and a nice grocery store and maybe even a good coffee shop? Like, shouldn't everybody have good coffee, right? Or a nice park? And of course, the answer is yes. And those communities, if we take an equity-based approach, they deserve it more than anyone because they've been denied it for so long that, but as you say, we've been told this narrative that the only way to get it is through gentrification or through the private sector essentially bringing investment and improvement to a neighborhood. So in order to kind of counter that narrative, I think we can use concepts like the right to stay put, right? That for people who have long contributed to a community, sustained it in the face of disinvestment, that they have the right to stay put when improvements come and to enjoy those improvements. We can use discourse like housing is a human right, to change that narrative as well. And I think just constantly working to denaturalize gentrification, like to show in your local context, right? Because it's different in different cities and so on. What decisions, what policies, what actions have actually led to gentrification or maybe led to disinvestment in that area, that it's not natural that places just either fall apart or get gentrified, right? So actually learning what the history is there and how it's happened to kind of push back and say, no, it's not just like this for no reason, right? Choices were made that led to this situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for your talk. I had a question about, it seems the book was released recently, but books take a long time to write. So, we probably you were writing this before COVID, and cities were in the spotlight a lot, especially in the initial days of coronavirus and people leaving the cities or what's going to happen with cities. I'm wondering how that kind of shaped your arguments and or maybe made you dig into some of the chapters you had or maybe rethink. And obviously it's not over. It's hard to tell what these longer term aspects or consequences will be. But yeah.
Yes, you're right about the timeline that I had started writing it before COVID, and then kind of, like everyone, got kind of thrown off at the beginning of the pandemic, and then returned I think I had a very rough first draft, and then finally returned to it and reshaped the book quite a lot. Not because of Corona per se, but one of the things that I talk about in the book is the kind of role of like disaster capitalism, right? As Naomi Klein called it, or like the shock doctrine, where when something kind of catastrophic happens, that this is in cities, whether it's quote unquote natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans almost 20 years ago, or a terrorist attack that blows up a city center like in Manchester in the 1990s, that these are often moments where kind of neoliberal governments see opportunity, right? Where they see, and this was so clear after Katrina, where within days, like not even 24, 48 hours, you had government saying things like, this is going to be great for New Orleans. We're going to start fresh. We've wiped away, like biblically, the problems of this poor, Black, corrupt, violent, crime-ridden city, and we're going to, build something fresh here. So with COVID, I think I draw on a piece by David Madden, who is writing that, this could be another one of those moments where we, especially at the beginning, where we had businesses closing down, right? Small businesses shuttering, people facing eviction, losing their jobs, that Corona could be kind of a mass displacement event. And some by choice, people leaving cities by choice, people who had the means to do so, to, change their lifestyle and so on. But for many people, just finding themselves in even more precarious housing situations than they were previously. And I think that this has, we're, as you say, we don't have the distance to know, but just kind of anecdotally seeing the ways in which so many people are teetering on the brink or fighting evictions. I think that that's related to the precarity that was promoted through Corona. And definitely some people are using it to their advantage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot for all this insight. I would like to ask, because you're researching a lot of cases, what kind of role art and art communities are playing? You said you're writing from a position of Toronto, for example. In from European Union, culture policy is urban regeneration is very welcome and also extremely hard and wealthy founded also open public policy. So this is also my question: how your standing is here to art. I'm a little bit always afraid when I see in our quarter if someone more arty is coming, something that means already the prices will go up. So yeah. And what is also in this way, in this sense also possibilities also to resist the gentrification, because it's not what you said, am I contributing to gentrification? A lot of time is that I don't want to contribute, but then yet I'm at the end of the day instrumentalized for that.
Yes, I guess speaking to the first part of your comment about the kind of cities very actively kind of co-opting the idea of arts and culture as key to urban regeneration or revitalization, whatever the term is that places like to use. And yes, we definitely have that in Canada and in cities all over the world, and an increased kind of like corporate involvement. So these kind of corporate funded art festivals and events that are meant to, attract tourism and bring, I don't know, new nightlife to different areas of the city. And I think from what I've read about it, a lot of artists feel very conflicted because these present rare opportunities for them to showcase their work to wider audiences, right, and to actually get some funding and support. But many of them also know that as these events kind of tiptoe into their communities, that they can be kind of like beacons, like that, the bat signal, right? Like lighting up their neighborhood and saying like, oh, look, things are kind of interesting and hip and cool over here. And that might, like lead to their own displacement relatively soon down the road, or to their neighbors and people that they care about. So I think it's put artists in a very terrible position of, as much like funding for the arts at the small scale has dried up and disappeared and been really, really hard to get. And, these big culture festivals come, and that's like the only way to sort of make a living. But I think artists have also always been gentrification resistors, even if they have been seen as that beacon of gentrification. It is, yes, in the chapter on resistance, there's a section on kind of how creativity is used to kind of tell different stories about gentrification. And it's certainly like an important avenue, I think, for telling or for communicating the impacts of gentrification in ways that are really that really connect with people more so than, policy and planning documents too. So I kind of, see artists in this very like difficult position of like trying to resist while also trying to make a living under very difficult circumstances.
Are there more questions for the moment? Okay. I also got more. No.
Well, so my question is regarding city planners. Like, do you think that they are aware of gentrification as a thing that they have to plan against? Or, such things like the city of 15 minutes where you can get everything in walking distance is something that I would say could be an example of planning for the people and not in order to create profit. So what is your insight into that aspect?
Well, I think sometimes some planners are working, if not completely against gentrification. They're aware that it can be a problem, and they're not necessarily trying to see communities displaced. But they don't always have the power or the tools at their disposal to really like put up strong barriers to gentrification. I think sometimes they do, and they should probably use them more. But if we were to use something like the 15-minute city as an example, and I think it's a good one because it's certainly an idea with a lot of potential, and it makes me think about like actually feminist planning arguments from like the 1970s and earlier that were, talking about the importance of having like all of these sites within close proximity. But if we don't include with those plans strong like anti-displacement measures, whether those include rent stabilization, the inclusion of more affordable nonprofit housing, anti-eviction measures, barriers to the commodification of housing, then we could end up with these 15-minute pockets being, the privilege of the few, which is kind of the way it already is for a lot of people in the city. If you have wealth and privilege, you can have a 15-minute life. So it's how do you get that 15-minute benefit to the people who would actually benefit it from the most and not lead to their displacement. So yeah, if planners want to implement that, then I think they need to see what other kind of suite of tools they can use alongside it.
Hello, thank you for all these interesting insights. Like being in Graz, I have a question. You were giving examples from big cities, Chicago, London, Bay Area. What about small scale cities? Do you talk about them in your book? or cities that lose in the fight for global capital or the competition? Is that something you were thinking about?
Yes, and I think that there are some examples from smaller cities around resistance to gentrification, and I do, I do talk a little bit about the way in which cities of all sizes are kind of often chasing the same agendas or trying to replicate things that they've seen happen in other bigger places. Whether those are, like the creative city, for example, is a great example of that, where it just kind of like proliferated, it spread everywhere. Even relatively small cities were kind of trying to take on this model of like creative regeneration of neighborhoods and of downtown districts, with varying degrees of success. And I think we could argue that this sense of urban competition, right, that cities are in competition with one another for investment capital, for upper income residents, for tourists, for certain kinds of like commercial activities, is one of the reasons cities promote gentrification, right? They see themselves as fighting with other cities for these like high value kind of targets, whether it's residents or investors and so on. And so they want to make themselves friendly to those kinds of people. So like New York City, I think I talk about Mayor Bloomberg calling it a luxury product. New York is a luxury product. It's not Walmart, he said, right? So clearly like communicating a message about who and what they want to happen there. And other cities kind of, they see themselves as losing in this urban competition if they don't try to replicate some of these ideas that are happening elsewhere. And so in that sense, I think often we see like what can sometimes seem like really weird things happening in small cities. You're like, why is there a new like, urban regeneration district happening here or something? Or why are they giving tax breaks to these developers? Like, why is this necessary here? But they're just kind of copycatting these other urban agendas out of this like, sense of losing out.
Are there more questions at the moment? Otherwise, yep.
Thanks, really fantastic talk. And it makes me think about the different moments when my life has been touched by gentrification, which actually has happened a couple of times. My question, can you speak a little bit about the tension between kind of social capital and the other capital? And I would also like to hear, what can governments, councils concretely do? Do you have some examples to really work for their citizens?
Do you mean, with the first part of your question about social capital, do you mean kind of like on an individual level, like what the social capital that different groups of people like bring into neighborhoods, or what?
Well, I think there is potentially a tension between the capitalist capital and social capital. Social capital, I mean, is what makes a healthy society, I guess, as a whole, or as a microcosmos.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for clarifying. I just wasn't. Wanted to make sure I was on the same page as you. I mean, I think there's probably more than a tension. There's probably a contradiction between those kinds of capital. If we think about capitalism as being, an extractive force that wants to take as much as possible from the many and transfer it into the hands of the few, then that, seems like the antithesis of what you're describing as a kind of social capital or community or collective collective care, support, collective forms of governance, for example, or civil society. I don't know that we can attain a kind of ideal in that social sense while we live under kind of rampant extractive neoliberal capitalism. I think people can, and I do say this in the book, I think that we don't have to also sit around and think like every single moment and interaction in our lives is totally controlled by capitalism, because I think that's also another kind of problematic narrative where we're like, well, everything's capitalism, so there's nothing else we can do. There are some moments and organizations and relationships and so on that I think do exist in a kind of outside of capitalism, and we can think about how we build and nourish those so they can grow and kind of form the basis of a new and better world. In terms of the second part of your question, like what can city councils do? So I guess before we abolish capitalism, before we get to that point, what can you push your local city council to do? Again, none of these are like the perfect be all and end all solution, but we could think about, I think there's an example in the book from Detroit where they've pushed for what's called community benefit ordinances. And by ordinance, we mean something that's actually like in the city bylaws, so that when new development takes place, there has to be some kind of tangible community benefit. And we don't just mean like they put some benches around the base of the building, but like something that would actually be useful for the community, whether it's employment opportunities, whether it's cleaning up pollution, whether it's a community center, whether it's ongoing funding, whether it's affordable housing units, like, and that the community has a say in what that is. So it's not just like, oh, well, we made a parkette, a little baby park, and called it a community benefit. So that's something that local governments can, they can implement those as laws. I don't know, maybe people have other examples that they know of as well that they want to share, but that's one that comes to mind. Yeah.
Thank you. There's nobody at the moment, so there's time for another question from me, and maybe it's a more critical one. I would like to talk about the dangers in the whole discourse on gentrification, maybe more in general, but also in your book, sometimes I had that kind of feeling. And if we are talking about a neighborhood that's maybe at the beginning of this process of gentrification, then we are talking a lot about the things that could get lost, about preserving the neighborhood, starting with the whole infrastructure, like the shops, the restaurants, because these shops and restaurants, they are meeting places and so on. So it's very often quite conservative what we are doing in that moment. And usually in the literature, we have these great examples of a black neighborhood in New York somewhere and so on. But if I think about the city where I live, we also have this kind of discourse, and it's a right-wing discourse. And the whole debate on gentrification somehow there is this danger, and it's quite open, because here the discourse is, oh yeah, with this movement of migration, the old shops are closing down, and now there are these new shops and these new spaces, and they're ruining the old ones. So yeah, maybe it's a danger, maybe it's not, or to put it in a question, where and how can we draw a red line that it's not open to this kind of right-wing conservative discourse on neighborhoods and on transformations that take place in a city.
Yes, I totally agree that it is a danger, and we definitely see examples of anti-gentrification ideas being kind of co-opted for these conservative purposes, or for a kind of NIMBY politics, right? Not in my backyard, where communities will, for example, oppose a multi-family kind of housing building because they want to preserve the neighborhood character, or they argue that it will bring in some kind of gentrification, when really that's not what it's about. It's about preserving like their property values and ensuring that there are not like lower income people or migrants or other newcomers moving into the neighborhood. So I think we do have to kind of really watch out for that. As for like how we draw that red line around it, I guess we have to, kind of keep our little like critical hats on and always be asking, who's benefiting from these kinds of, I don't know, political discourse movements. And I mean, a helpful thing that I try to keep in mind, when I was working on Feminist City on this book as well, is sort of that question of like, will this change whatever it is, or will stopping this change benefit the most marginalized members of a community? And if it doesn't kind of pass that test, then you kind of, you're maybe sniffing out something problematic going on. But I agree that it is a problem, and it's kind of, it's hard to watch that co-optation happen.
Are there more questions, comments? Not at the moment. Maybe it's the last chance. Just want to tell, because I would have a final question. So I'll wait a few seconds. If somebody's thinking like, oh yeah, I've always wanted to know about gentrification. Never asked, and now it's too late. But you can
never ask me again.
I got something like a final question, and I always love to come to an end with an optimistic end. What I really loved about your book was, I loved the whole book, but especially the last chapter. And I think also for people who are not interested in this whole gentrification thing and what's going on in the city, maybe you live somewhere up in the mountains and you don't care about all these kind of things. But especially in the last chapter, there were some very really fantastic general advices for all of us who are active in movements and who are struggling against all the evils of the world. And at the very end, I talk about the very end of the book.
You're gonna spoil it? No.
Yeah, it's terrible. But I liked it that much. You say, you quote, it's a quote actually, and it's about hope is a discipline. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, so that is a quote from Mariam Kaba, who is a pretty prominent abolition writer and activist. She has a fairly recent book called "We Do This Till We Free Us," and it's all about prison abolition and abolishing the police. So people often ask her, right, like, aren't you doing an impossible project, right? Essentially trying to abolish the criminal justice system as we know it, abolish policing, end imprisonment. Like, how do you kind of get up every day? Like, every day you get up and you see something horrible in the news. Every day people are pushing back against your ideas. Every day people are telling you you are absolutely out of your mind for even thinking that this is a possibility. And one of her responses is that like hope is not something that you kind of like just pull from the air and you hope that hope is there. She says it's a discipline, it's a practice, it's something that you have to like intentionally grab hold of. And for her, she notes that like the timeline of abolition is probably not in her lifetime, right? And the same with like the timeline of a true, non-commodified housing market, housing as a human right, universal housing access for everyone. That might not be in the timeline of my lifetime, for example, or it might be quite a ways down down the road. But rather than feeling hopeless about that, it's like the question is, well, what could I do in my short time that I have on this planet to try to move things, even tiny baby steps, in that direction, or at least not move them in the opposite direction. And so for me, I'm a writer, I'm a professor, I'm a teacher. So those are some of the ways that I contribute. There are many other ways to do that as well. And so I hope that people leave with a sense of like, whatever your role is, your sphere of influence, the power that you have in certain areas of your life, that you can use that and not necessarily feel as though you have to see immediate results to still feel hopeful about what you're doing and to still feel good about the potential for change in the world. Yeah.
In the book, it's totally different, So,
what did I say?
No, I just wanted to say that you still should get the book. I think we are and it's over there in the corner. I think we are at the end for tonight. And the great thing about this question of hope is also that we somehow could link it to what's going on here at Forum Stadtberg, because they are we hear a lot of talks, exhibitions, and so on about the question of Ohnmacht, and I think it's very close to the powerlessness, more or less. The question of Ohnmacht is very close also to that question of hope, and that brings me to two things. One is that there is an exhibition going on here, and tonight you have the chance to visit it or to see it because it's open till 10. So you don't have to come back tomorrow or the day after tomorrow and so on. And one thing I shouldn't forget is the next debating society is taking place on the 7th of June. And there will be here Shader Kurt with her book about hate. The day before, she's presenting the book about love and then about hate. So we somehow bring that together. I hope that you will be here a few more minutes. And so maybe you can ask all the questions you didn't ask till now. And thanks a lot for coming, for the presentation. And good luck for the tour you planned for the next few days and weeks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here.